Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So, Terra continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA project, and we're following up our Could MiSTer Run Model 2 video with a Could MiSTer Run Model 1 video because you guys asked for it, and I am here to deliver and take a look at the spec because I do think it would be possible. Before we get too far involved, big thanks to our sponsor, MiSTer Add-ons. They're going to be sponsoring all the Thursday videos moving forward. I use all their hardware to capture everything MiSTer related on the channel, and I'll leave a link to their store below. But obviously, Model 1 kicked off the 3D renaissance for Sega when we went through Model 1, Model 2, and Model 3. And it all got its start on Sega Model 1. And when I say when these things came out in arcades, people's minds are blown, I absolutely mean it. I remember the first time I saw Star Wars running on Model 1 hardware in arcades as a kid. Obviously I had no idea what Model 1 meant or even did. I just knew that 3D gaming was in my local arcade, and I had seen absolutely nothing like this at home. So that's why it would be so amazing if we could bring Sega Model 1 over to MiSTer. Obviously this is a Konami board, but there's so many different 3D boards available that could potentially run on MiSTer, Model 1 being one of the biggest. But let's take a look at the Model 1 specifications in and of themselves because we need to know what it is running and whether or not that would be possible on MiSTer FPGA because it is a very complicated board. There's so many different chips on this, it would be a very heavy task to get everything working on MiSTer. That's not to say that it couldn't be possible, I'm just saying that the work involved would be absolutely massive. And we'll take a look here, there's so many different boards, main board, video board, memory board, IO board. There's boards for absolutely everything, and all of those would need to be incorporated maybe outside of the amp board for the audio. But if we take a look at the main CPU, it's an NEC V60 running at 16 MHz, and that is well within the clock speeds that are possible on something like MiSTer FPGA. It is not a very high performance CPU, but you get a lot out of it, and that's going to be handling everything from the game program to the logic, all of the different implementations for your opponent's AI, all of the things that are going to be going into running a game, not displaying the graphics, are going to be going across on that NEC V60. And the interesting thing is, it was not the first time Sega had used this chip. You'll see here we also have 3X Zilog Z80 CPUs, and those are definitely already being used in different cores on MiSTer. But interestingly enough, if you go back to System 32, you're going to be finding these same two chips again. So if we did have something like Sega Model 1 on MiSTer FPGA, that would also lead primarily into the work that would be required to get System 32 running as well, outside of the video chips. And I know that System 32 has been one of the most requested arcade cores on that side of MiSTer, and hopefully we do see that one day. As we take a look at the System 32 specs, and trust me, I'm just tying these back into Model 1, it's a Model 1 video, you're going to see we have the identical specifications we just looked at. The CPU is going to be the NEC V60 at 16 MHz, and the sound CPU is going to be the Zilog Z80 at 8 MHz, or the Z80 for everyone that's not in America, so I get you guys incorporated as well. And those are going to be what's running everything non-graphically. When we move over to Star Wars here, this CPU goes a long way. It does great for 2D, it does great for 3D, it is just running the code, and the sound CPU obviously just producing the sound. So these systems are going to have a very similar sound. So if something like Model 1 would work, we could be able to play something potentially like Jurassic Park, which is also an incredible game on the System 32 side of things. Sega's hardware was always derivative. They would always use something from one system and put it into the other. So popping back over to the specifications of Model 1, you're going to see that we have this Toshiba sound CPU, and if you haven't noticed already, it's 68,000 base, and then we have two custom Sega chips. But the interesting thing is, more often than not, Sega customs were just resilks of different people's hardware that was very common in arcade hardware, and this is a Yamaha chip. And interestingly, it's been used multiple times on the Sega System 32 Multi, the Sega Model 1, and the Sega Model 2, and I did that Model 2 potential video last year, so you're going to see that some of this work would go towards so many different arcade boards. It is interesting how often Sega would recycle different chips from different boards, and if you take a look at different hardware generations from Sega in the arcade sphere, you're going to see a lot of borrowing of what they already used, which is totally normal in arcade hardware. Use what you know. If it gets the job done, 100% do it. Something like Model 2 is using the same sound processor as Model 1 is, so go ahead and listen to Model 1 sound for 30 seconds, get a sense of what it's like, and I'll be right back with more specs. Sounds great, and I would love to hear that coming out of MiSTer FPGA. But obviously a CPU and sound are only 2/3 of the entire board. We have to talk about the graphics, and it does have a metric crap ton of chips on it. It's going to have 5 of these Fujitsu digital signal processors on board. That's a lot of chips to fit within the space of the FPGA, but I'm sure there could be some sort of trickery involved, and obviously at 16 megahertz, that's well within the limits of what something like MiSTer could do. We already have the turbo clock core speeds of the Nintendo 64 Turbo Core, so we know we are good. And there's also been some work done on the decapping side of these chips as well. To try to understand how a chip works, there's multiple different ways to do it, but one of the ones that is very effective and people have already done in some instances is actually decapping the chip. You take all of that substrate off so you can actually get down to the die layer and use a microscopic camera to be able to actually photograph the chip so you can see all of the different layout structure and all of the tracing and all of the paths that actually makes up the chip. A lot of people will use these to basically reverse engineer how something's supposed to function. The Neo Geo core on MiSTer FPGA, there are a lot of different scans of decap chips for the Neo Geo, and that's very popular. But this is what this digital signal processor is, and there's 5 of them on board according to the spec sheet. So you'd have to have 5 instances of a processor like this running to be able to run something like Model 1 on MiSTer FPGA. And I know these just look like hidden eye puzzles where you cross your eye and try to see something, but that's actually the entire chip structure. But something like Virtua Racing is just such an incredible game, and I know there's more than one way to play this. There's obviously the Switch version that M2 did, and it's a spectacular port, but it would be so incredible to see Sega Model 1 actually running on something like MiSTer FPGA, not just from a preservation standpoint, but from a fun standpoint, and also a standpoint of everything else it would possibly bring us. You're going to see here on the GPU rasterizer board, we have the video PCB running at 36 megahertz with custom chips. There are a lot of them on board here as well, so not every single thing on Sega Model 1 has been decapped. Some of these GAL chips down below, they're going to be there in multiples of 3. Just like Model 2 video before, Sega would throw a different piece of silicon on the board to do just one thing, and they would absolutely fill the board with as many chips as they possibly could. But it ended up being such a great result. It was such an amazing board when these things were in arcades, and unfortunately a lot of these boards are becoming extinct. Sure, collectors have them, and I'm one of them, but if you walk into an arcade today, odds are you're not going to see any Sega Model 1 games on the arcade floor. Model 2 and Model 3 are going to be way more common, so in some instances, the only way to play these games on real hardware would be something potentially like MiSTer. And you'll see here that with all effects turned on, it's pushing 180 polygons per second, and while those sort of numbers aren't indicative of actually being able to run on MiSTer FPGA, we obviously know on the 3D side we have games and hardware that are pushing way more polys at a higher clock speed with more advanced hardware functioning today like the Nintendo 64 core does. Well, let's take a look at the memory on Model 1 because that is always important as well, and sometimes when you read a spec sheet, be aware when it says memory up to, a lot of times that's just dealing with the read-only memory of the game itself. We want to be looking at RAM, because on the system side of things we have 2,776 kilobytes, and the main RAM is only going to be 480 kilobytes. Basically, across the entire Model 1 board, it really doesn't utilize that much RAM, and that's because 1, it wasn't necessary, and 2, it was quite expensive back in the day. Memory's always not been cheap, but back in this area, you definitely didn't want to throw a RAM on that you didn't need whatsoever. If we move back over to the Nintendo 64 core, we already have an instance of a console running with 8 megabytes of RAM. Obviously, that's RD RAM on a RAM bus design, so it doesn't function the exact same way as something like Model 1 does, but there is one caveat in this entire RAM section, and that is the bus speed at which it runs. Something like Nintendo 64 is going to be in the mid 500s, and we know it doesn't need to run that fast based on the Nintendo 64 core, but for Model 1 you have basically 665 megabytes per second. I rounded up there slightly to make it easier on myself, but it's possible that it doesn't ever run at that speed. It could just be a theoretical, because if Nintendo 64 can run, I feel like Model 1 would get very close, and my guess would be that the theoretical maximum of that RAM bus actually isn't utilized whatsoever, and it probably runs slower than that. I don't have any evidence of that. I'd have to get an oscilloscope out and start checking things, but that would be my presumption. But it would be so amazing to see something like Model 1 alongside Nintendo 64, because if we can have this, I feel like Model 1 would be a possibility as well. And that's the other thing about the Sega Model 1. It would lead directly into work on a System 32 core. Or you could totally invert that work process, do System 32 first, and then follow along with a potential Model 1 core, because the work on one would be derivative for the other, and that would just be a great thing. But that's my theory on whether or not Model 1 would work on MiSTer FPGA. Every sign points to yes. Obviously somebody would have to take the time to do the work, and it's not like Model 1 has the biggest library. But leave me a comment down below and tell me what's the one core you would love to see on the arcade side of things. I would be curious. Short of that, we're done, and I will see you guys next time. Go play some arcade games. Bye bye.